You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Fresh is best. It's a common adage among those interested in food, and it makes sense as various compounds found in food products are known to degrade or even morph or evolve over time. Such is certainly the case in brewing, where we rely heavily on things like malted barley, yeast, which is a living organism, and of course everyone's favorite cousin of Bob Marley's preferred flower, hops. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the impact age has on hops, specifically Cascade hops, when used in an American pale ale, is contributor Martin Keene.
Well, Marshall, I don't know about you, but there have been times where I've opened up my freezer and stuck down the back there were a packet of hops, and they've been there for years, and it kind of got me thinking, as was the case with these Cascade hops. These things are like 5 years old. Are they any good still? Can I still use them? If I do use them, what would the impact of that be? Would they still be good? Would it mess up the bitterness? Would I lose some aroma and flavor and so forth? So that's what we wanted to find out.
Absolutely. And I'm sure most brewers can relate with this, but when I first started brewing, hop freshness wasn't really something I thought much about. I'd buy a recipe kit from the local homebrew shop that I didn't put much thought into, and I'd take it home and I'd use whatever was in that kit to make this beer, kind of just trusting that the shop wouldn't sell me ingredients that would lead to a crappy end product. Well, it really wasn't until I moved into brewing all grain and started purchasing ingredients in bulk, particularly from YakimaValleyHops.com, that it became an issue. Then again, is it even an issue? Like you said, Martin, that's exactly what our focus is going to be in this episode. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world coming up in April of 2024. Dana Garvis, founder of Oregon Brew Lab, will be hanging out with patrons. We had a little bit of a mix-up when she was supposed to be on last month, so she's coming back in April. In addition to being an accomplished homebrewer, Dana is a trained brewing chemist who helped build the quality control lab at Oregon's Ninkasi Brewing Company before starting her own company in 2016. Oregon Brew Lab offers a variety of essential analyses for affordable prices to both commercial and homebrewers. We've had the pleasure of working with Oregon Brew Lab many times over the years, and Dana is truly an incredible member of the brewing community. I'm really looking forward to this session. If you want to be a part of it, be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Friday, April 26, 2024, as Dana's going to be taking questions on Saturday the 27th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook and Patreon pages, so folks can go back and watch them whenever they like. Again, that's patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Be a part of what keeps us going. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that, as well as it helps those who have yet to hear about the Brewlosophy podcast to more easily find the show. Plus, we really enjoy knowing what you think. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make that jump to electric, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Well, I can't say I didn't expect it, but we've continued to receive a ton of feedback on the whole AHA and the HomebrewCon debacle. Since we already did one episode covering listener feedback on our Brews Views topic, or that episode where we focused on that, I'm inclined to not beat that dead horse much longer, but I do want to honor those who sent their thoughts in. So I think what we're going to do is just include these bits of feedback in our regular episodes. So the first one, we're just going to do one here, but it comes from Brian Bishk. He shot us the following message. He says, I've always wanted to reach out to you all. Thank you all for all you do. I've been listening for a few years and have encouraged many others to do so. I've been brewing for over 20 years now, and I'm still learning. Since listening, I've made several changes, including burst carbonation, using gelatin when finishing my beers, and not worrying about trying to hit every number. Short and shoddy? Well, I'm not there yet, but there is hope. That's a tough one for a 20-plus year brewer. The catalyst for finally writing to you was the AHA episodes. I've been on and off again as a member, and I'm currently a member. As many have since noted, it's sad to see the state of the AHA. I joined because I wanted to be a part of something bigger for my hobby. I've always wanted to go to the HomebrewCon, and I'm still kicking myself for not going to Minneapolis, which is in my region. Right now, it doesn't look good for the future. After listening to the episodes, I wanted to research more before I made any opinion. I did listen to the John Hall interview and was completely turned off by Julia Hertz and her seemingly pompous attitude, which is how I took it. Her, quote, mortgage snipe undoubtedly put me off, but it also felt like we needed to pay homage to what the AHA has done in the past to continue being a member. I then searched the blogs to discover more information before making my choice. I then stumbled upon a post from Julia on the AHA blogs where she posted a well-crafted dissertation marketing piece in response to a few questions. Again, the AHA put me off. After all that, I went to my AHA account and turned off automatic payments. After that, I thought I'd put my money where I continue to learn from Brewlosophy. I've been a Patreon for a while, but at the $3 level, so I bumped that up to the $5 level, and I'm looking forward to some great hop deals. First off, I want to thank you for your patronage, for helping us to continue doing what we do. And I know that what we offer is vastly different than what the AHA or even other outfits are offering out there. We all have our different unique spins, and for to hear that you are still appreciating what we're doing and throwing some support our way, I do appreciate that. But Martin, what do you think about his research that he did and his ultimate decision to stop being a member of the AHA?
Yeah, and it follows a somewhat similar path to me. I have been an AHA member up until recently, and like Brian, I'm also super bummed that I didn't take the opportunity to get to a HomebrewCon. And I've seen some of the cool stuff that's been going on there, even with Brewlosophy. There was a little bit of unofficial data collection there, which looked like it was quite fun. A bunch of the YouTube brewers were going to put together a session this year, so I was finally planning on actually going, and then just waited 1 year too long. So yeah, it's such a shame the way it's gone. And it's been really interesting as well, listening to all of this feedback. And actually sort of how unified it all is, that everybody is really quite disappointed with the way things that have turned out. And I don't know how this is going to get resolved in the future, but it does seem that there was still so much interest just from what we've heard from the feedback, that maybe there's still an opportunity for something after next year.
Yeah, I actually hopped on a call with John Hall recently, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing that. He had some questions based on all of what he's heard us talk about and us talking about what we heard him talking about with Julia, and it was a great conversation. He's a wonderful person. If you haven't listened to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast, that's John Hall's podcast. He's from All About Beer, fantastic person. But I jumped on a call with him last week, and yeah, he and I kind of have a similar perspective. And I think the first point that I want to make, I don't know if I made it clear in those 2 episodes that we've addressed this issue so far. I don't know Julia Hertz very well on a personal level, but I think it's fair to say her responses on that podcast with John, even the mortgage thing, they were, you have to remember that she's making those as an employee of the AHA, which is under the Brewers Association. So she has to represent them. She wasn't there as a private individual, as odd as that may sound. John did an excellent job of asking the pertinent questions, and I'm sure she was implored by the powers that be at the BA to not say certain things or to say only these things. Is that Julia's fault? I mean, one could argue that her choosing to stay in that position, put some responsibility on her. But my perspective is that it's just more validation of how screwed up the BA is overall. It's utterly lacking in transparency, honesty, and worst of all, integrity. At this point, I'm sure even some craft brewers are realizing that they don't need the BA needs them. I mean, that doesn't feel good when you're the one shoveling money in their direction. What do they offer you these days? if I was a professional brewer, I'd be doing the same thing with my BA membership that I did with my AHA membership. That's where I'm at. But I did want to get out there. I don't think that we need to, use Julia necessarily as the scapegoat here. She's just another cog in that wheel at this point and doing the best she can because that's her job. So I understand that piece of it. I do feel like the BA likely put in, some filters there and we're like, do not discuss these things if you're going to go public. And maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? But they are, I said it before, I'll say it again. I don't know how you pull out of this tailspin, and we're just going to have to sit back and watch. If they do, and they're still part of the BA, I won't be joining the AHA, so you won't see me at another HomebrewCon anyways. If something else comes out of this, if the phoenix that rises from the ashes is something that is dissociated from the Brewers Association, then yeah, I think there's, some opportunity there. But again, those are my thoughts. You're going to continue to hear them, I'm sure, for months to come because this is a hot topic right now. So thank you for writing in, Brian. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you haven't already, go subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophy Show with a U, no umlaut. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show. Martin, you seem to be having a ton of fun with that project over there. Things are going well, eh?
Yeah, and we have just seen a huge uptick as well in the interest in some of the videos. And I'm so pleased, by the way, that you give this little shout out on the podcast to the YouTube channel, because I know as a YouTuber, I'm always supposed to be trawling out the like and subscribe stuff, and I've never, ever brought myself to say it. So I appreciate that you do.
Hey, so go ahead and smash that subscribe button, right? That's it. But again, that's The Brewlosophy Show on YouTube. Martin's producing all sorts of fun content that we are confident you're going to enjoy very much. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on the impact age has on Cascade hops. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
Rev up the savings at JCPenney's Power Penny Days. Starting Wednesday, wrap up huge deals like Home Expressions Quick Dry Bath Towels, only $5. Stock up on fresh lineups of tees and tanks. Women's styles start at $9, and kids' thereabouts tees start at $7. Plus, bring home extra bling. Yes, please, lab-created gemstones, only $13 while they last. JCPenney, make everybody count. Offers valid on select styles 410 to 414. Power Penny deals excluded from coupons. Other exclusions apply. See store or jcp.com for details.
Hey y'all, Darius Rucker here. A lot of people ask me, what inspires your music? And one of the big things is a strong sense of place. That's why I love my home state of South Carolina and want to share the awesome things it has to offer. From the beautiful mountains down to the sunny coast, it's got it all. Not to mention two of my personal favorites, great golf and amazing food. Come see why I love this place. Visit discoversouthcarolina.com.
There's this widely accepted idea that fresh ingredients lead to a fresher tasting end product, and quote, fresher is synonymous with better. Now, obviously, this isn't universal in brewing. I mean, there are some who adamantly contend that certain beer styles like Imperial Stout, Old Ale, and even Pale Lager improve with a little age. However, when it comes to hops, few would deny that fresh is best. As we do, I'd like to start off by covering some basics about hops up front first.
That's right. So let's take a look at what hops are and why we want to use them for beer. I mean, I think, Marshall, you sneaked in a little reference to Bob Marley right up front there. This is the flower related to cannabis. And the thing that we're interested in is the thing called lupulin, which is the primary agent that brewers are after. It's a yellow powder that has a lot of bitterness in it, and it contains all sorts of resins, oils, and terpenes that give a beer bitterness, aroma, and flavor. And if you're kind of interested in what some of those oils and terpenes are, the way I've really got familiar with that is to go to yakimaValleyHops.com, look up a particular hop, and they normally have the breakdown in percentages of what sort of hop oils you have in each of these hops. And that's really sort of helped me understand the difference between what some of these hops are. So I'll know that, for example, if a hop has a high myrcene level, that is going to be kind of the piney, green, or resinous type of hop. And then if it has a high geraniol content, then that's going to be a bit more floral. So based upon those percentages of the makeup of the lupulin, that really gives you an idea of what you can expect from that hop.
Right. And we're going to get into the freshness specifically in a minute, but that lupulin is what, if you look at a lot of these modern hop products like Lupo Max, what they're doing is concentrating that lupulin because it really is what brewers are after through science. And we've learned that really is the key, and it's a beautiful, beautiful compound that does so much for us for beer. So now thinking about the history of hop usage when it comes to beer, at least the earliest documented use of hops for beer was in the 9th century. I mean, that's a long ass time ago, prior to which beer, what they called gruit, really was spiced with various bitter herbs and flowers. There are actually recipes you can find online for these really old gruit gruit drink things where they're using root bark and roots and all of these different types of herbs. Well, hops kind of I think normalized the beer thing, right? You can't have beer without hops now, and they did so much. They balanced the sweetness with that bitterness that we get from hops. Plus, they imparted this very desirable aroma and flavor characteristics. So that's a really good thing about hops. Now, why hops? Flavor and aroma is a big deal. We all know that, but they also seem to have this really interesting antimicrobial property. Isoalpha acids have particularly strong action against gram-positive bacteria, such as lactobacillus, which can very quickly spoil beer. So you imagine these, early brewers who want to get that beer off to their military or their workers in another country or something, and they put it on a ship, and by the time it gets there, it's just spoiled. It's been taken over by some bacteria. Well, now they throw all these hops in it, and what do you know? How cool that this stuff has a preservative property, and this beer has a better shelf life purely because of the use of hops. I think it's a pretty cool thing that we really deserve to, it deserves the credit it gets, we'll say.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this sort of makes you think of the bit of hackneyed IPA story about this is how IPA came to be because these beers were highly hopped, so they would survive the ship's journey to India and stuff like that. Whether or not that's true, the fact is that the fact that you have these hops in here, they are providing this protection for the beer, stop it spoiling. And it just happens to also have a rather fortunate fact that we can now take advantage of all these aromas and flavors as well. But that does have the presumption, of course, that we are using fresh hops, right?
So hop freshness, just like a lot of cooking ingredients. I've said it before, but the freshest you can use it. I mean, if you listen to the Yakima Valley Hops folks, I mean, they're constantly talking about fresh from the source. I mean, it's an important thing because what we know about hops is that the longer that they stay in certain conditions, the older they get, there's certain changes that take place that we're going to break down. Now, with modern advancements in sanitation and understanding of brewing process, spoilage is much less of a concern, sort of as you mentioned, which allows us to focus almost specifically on the aroma and flavor qualities that we're extracting from these hops by using them in our beer. And in this respect, freshness is highly correlated with quality. There's a lot that can happen to hops. So, for example, the degradation of isoalpha acids, which remember that isoalpha acids are present in hops, and then once those isoalpha acids reach a specific temperature, they become isomerized into alpha acids, and that is the bitterness that we expect in beer. Well, over time, those isoalpha acids can degrade, reducing a hop's bittering potential. In fact, if you look at most calculators, online recipe calculators, there is a spot where, if you are so inclined, you can put in the age of your hops, and it will actually reduce the bitterness that those hops are expected to contribute contribute to your beer because of what we know about this degradation of alpha acids.
Right, absolutely. And that degradation is not a linear degradation. So it's not, we can very easily say this many days at this temperature is going to lead to this amount of spoilage and so forth. And we also have to look at how that degradation affects the bittering potential of the hops, because we're looking at two acids here. We're looking at the alpha and the beta acids, and the beta acids take longer to break down over time. So we might see more degradation of the alpha acids, and that will leave just more of the beta acids in there. I'm trying really hard to say beta and not beta. I appreciate my translations here. And that can lead to a difference in the bitterness of the hops, or how harsh that bitterness is, which is actually something I've experienced.
Yeah, okay. I want to hear your stories about that, because I've experienced it as well. And what I learned in using, very intentionally, of course, we're Brewlosophy, and using these really old oxidized hops. Oxidation is another very serious concern we'll get to. But when you use them, it creates this bitterness that is impossible to not notice because it is so drastically different from any alpha acid bitterness that you might have experienced. I've made highly hopped, like upfront IPA, old school, late 90s, early 2000s versions of just bitter bomb IPAs that lack the sharpness of this beta acid bitterness that we're referring to. And to me, it's a telltale sign that somebody is using old hops, and it's nasty. I can't stand it.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience of that came back in my extract days of using Brewer's Best kits. And those kits, they contain the extract and the dry yeast packet, but they also have the hops sat in these packets as well, just in a box, sat out at room temperature, potentially for a couple of years from the store that I was buying them from. And I would find that the Brewer's Best kits that I would brew the maltier styles on would come out actually pretty great, but the hoppier you went, especially their double IPA kit, was really a very unpleasant bitterness, and I totally pull that down to the fact that it is old hops just sat in a bag at room temperature, oxidized over that period of time.
It is something else, I'll tell you. And oddly enough, and I love talking about the subjectivity of preference. If I start a band, we should call it subjectivity of preference, because we mention this so often on the show. I did an experiment similar to the one we're going to be talking about in this episode, but also different, many years ago, and used very old oxidized hops that have been sitting out in the summer. They were just awful, but I wanted to see what would happen. There was a few people in that experiment who said that they liked that beta acid, bitter, gross, in my opinion, beer more. And so that, whatever floats your boat, if that's what you like, hey, go ask all your friends if you can have their old oxidized hops. So again, there are a few things that we need to pay attention to when it comes to hop freshness. One of them obviously is just age. Things happen over time. We understand that. Another one is oxidation. Now, when you open up, if you're storing your bag, your hops in a vacuum sealed bag or the Mylar bag they come from YVH in, every time you open those, there's going to be some oxygen exposure. And the idea is just to try to reduce that as much as possible. If that oxygen gets in there, what ultimately ends up happening is that it can convert, the aromas that we want into these kind of, undesirable, cheesy, it's called isovaleric acid. But it's kind of this cheesy sweat sock type of an aroma. The only time I've ever smelled this, I'll be honest, it could be that I'm not sensitive to it. The only time I've ever picked it up is when I've taken hops, put them in a bowl, left them out for 24 hours, and then came back to whiff them. It's kind of hard to miss in that scenario. I don't know if many people are doing that prior to brewing their beers. So typically, again, the telltale sign for me that old hops were used is just that really sharp, unpleasant bitterness. I haven't really gotten the old cheesy thing in a beer. Maybe you have. It can also come from Brettanomyces. So if you've ever brewed like a Brett beer and you've gotten kind of a cheesy thing, it's a similar character as that.
Yeah, I've not either. And I was reading up a little bit about isovaleric acid, and yeah, it's described as sweaty, cheesy sock aroma. That doesn't
sounds great, right?
Doesn't sound like, yes, everything's subjective, but I can't imagine there is anybody who wants that in their beer.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. So naturally, with these issues or these concerns when it comes to hop freshness, there are certain things brewers can do to, further the preservation of their hops to hopefully extend their shelf life. The first thing, and probably I think this is just universal at this point, is storage temperature. If you're going to buy hops in bulk or you have anything left over, throw them in your fridge, or more preferably, throw them in your freezer. Things get massively retarded as the temperature goes down. In fact, for every 27 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius increase in storage temperature, you're doubling the rate of your alpha acid loss. Now, these are like stats that I pulled from other folks. We haven't tested this, of course, but if 70% of the alpha remains at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 C over 6 months, so a loss of 30%, storage in a 0 degree Fahrenheit or negative 18 C freezer can dramatically slow this down, reducing that loss to around 6% instead of 30%. So kind of an example that I put together here, if you've got a 10% alpha acid reduces to 7% alpha acid at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, room temp at 20 C, after 6 months, it would remain above 9% if you stored it in your freezer. So these is like one of the simplest things that you can do, particularly in terms of the preservation of isoalpha acids to, better your shelf life of hops. And I think it's great. I've always stored my hops in the freezer, in part because it gets them out of the way, but also because of this preservation quality.
Right. Absolutely. So storage in the freezer is really the way to go. And it's interesting because I'm quite into craft coffee as well. And when you buy coffee beans, they have really kind of a 30-day freshness window, which becomes really important if you're making an espresso, because not only can you taste the difference, but you can very quickly tell if you're using old coffee beans with espresso, because the pressurized water, as it passes through the puck, goes through way too quickly if there are not enough coffee oils present. And it has the same kind of idea here. So for every 1 day of aging at room temperature with coffee beans, if you put those same coffee beans in the freezer, it takes 90 days to get the equivalent of 1 day of leaving them on the counter.
Wow.
So that means that to keep within that 30-day window, if you get the coffee beans fresh from the roast and you put them straight in the freezer, that 30-day freshness window will last for over 5 years. So it absolutely makes sense to freeze these things, keep the oils in, keep the oxygen out, and then you really can extend the life of how long these things can be used.
So just anecdotally, you just mentioned also keep the oxygen out. That's something that I think most people who are new to the bulk world of brewing, you get really excited. You pick up 10 pounds of hops that are going to take you a year and a half to use or whatever. But then you're like, well, I only want to use, 3 ounces of these Cascade hops, and I've got a whole pound of it. What do I do? How do I keep the oxygen out as best as possible? What has been your approach, and what are you doing these days?
I love that you ask that, because my approach was to copy you down to the exact same sealer that you use, the vacuum sealer. So I think you put out an article on Brewlosophy years ago about this. The idea being that you would take your unused hops, you'd put them in one of these vacuum sealer bags, seal them up, and then just toss them in the freezer. And the next time you need to get some hops, you cut it open, take the hops out, reseal it again. And I did that for years and years. And I told you kind of about that when I joined Brewlosophy. I was like, proudly I was doing this. And you were like, no, I don't do that anymore. So tell me what you do. So
I don't do that anymore. In fact, my vacuum sealer is sitting, it still works great, but it's been sitting in the same spot in my garage for the last, 3 or 4 years, and just hasn't gotten any use because, I take what industry professionals say seriously. I tend to put a little bit more weight in that than I do, Joe Schmo from down the street. And they were telling me that this whole vacuum sealing is overkill. You do it if you're going to, if you're going to have a lot of exposure to the air, then vacuum sealing is going to be a sort of a prophylactic against things potentially happening while it's in the freezer. But what they explained to me was up in Yakima, they were saying the Mylar bags that hops come in, it's a similar thing for commercial brewers. They get like 44 pounds in the same Mylar bags. They're like, if you're keeping it in the freezer and you're just pulling a few ounces out at a time and then sealing that bag back up and popping them in the freezer, that you're not going to have oxidized hops. So I just started doing that and really being being grateful that Yakima Valley Hops packages their hops the way that they do in those bags, which they flush with an inert gas before sending them out. So when you get them, they are ostensibly, right, oxygen free. And so any oxygen exposure they're going to have past the point of packaging is just going to be from you popping that bag open for a couple seconds, pouring some hops out, and then putting them back in the freezer. So I don't do the vacuum sealing thing anymore. I haven't for a long time. And I haven't personally noticed that it's had a negative impact. But again, I'm, squeezing as much air out of that bag as possible and storing them in a dark, we're going to talk about light here, in a dark freezer. And that is going to retard any degradation that's going to happen anyways. So did you follow my lead on that one too, Martin? Or are you still using the vacuum sealer?
No, the vacuum sealer is sat in the corner, unused. I am also using those exact same Mylar bags that come from Yakima Valley Hops. I'll do the same thing. I'll take my hops out, then I'll seal it almost all the way, and then just kind of squeeze the bag to get any other air that's out. And that seems to be quite sufficient. I have kept hops for quite a long time using that. And the other point that you kind of hinted at is light. Well, with the old vacuum sealer bags I'm using, they don't stop any light coming in. And with the Mylar bags, of course, that does prevent the light coming in, and it's purported that light can increase the rate of alpha acid degradation. So nice not to have that. I mean, yes, it's in the freezer, but the freezer gets opened quite a lot, so there is light getting in, and so I'd much rather keep them in those Mylar bags. Yeah,
and like so many things in brewing, I feel like you take any one of these things, oxidation is the boogeyman, right? We all know that for everything. Whether it's, you've got swaths of people even saying your malt can be over oxidized before you brew with it. But so that one I'm going to kind of set aside in its own little castle, because we hate oxidation. But light, who knows? I've left hops out in the light for about 45 minutes before, like, intentionally put them in a ray of light coming through my window, sunlight, for about 45 minutes before tossing them into boiling wort, and I didn't notice any difference. But maybe it's also a function of time. So it has to, that UV has to have contact or be, the hops have to be exposed to it for a certain amount of time before that alpha acid degrades. Who knows? But better safe than sorry. And that's the way I think about it. So now for the experiment we're going to talk about in the next section, you did focus on American Pale Ale, which I think is great. Obviously, when most people think of hoppy beers, they're probably thinking of IPA, but American Pale Ale, or at least modern versions of it these days, do tend to be a bit more hop forward than what I experienced with American Pale Ale when I first started drinking, over 20 years ago. The BJCP describes American Pale Ale as an average strength, hop forward, pale American craft beer with sufficient supporting malt to make the beer balanced and drinkable. The clean hop presence can reflect classic or modern American or New World hop varieties with a range of characteristics. It's one of my favorite styles, specifically because of how the BJCP describes it. It's just a wonderfully balanced hoppy beer.
Yeah, and that's why I picked it too. I love American Pale Ale. And so if we think about the impact potentially that we could have from using old hops in American Pale Ale, based on everything we've just discussed, we would expect to see perhaps that there would be reduced alpha acid. So it could just be that we don't get enough bitterness at all in the pale ale. If these hops are a bit oxidized, then we've talked about how we can have this sort of unpleasant bitterness, this sort of acidic bitterness that you get from the beta acids. We could also get those dreaded cheesy or sweaty sock aromas and flavors. Let's hope not, but that is something potential. Or just generally a more muted hop. So that would be the concern. That all said, I have brewed a beer where I debittered hops. So I kind of did all of these things deliberately. It was for a lambic. And the idea with a lambic is you don't want any bitterness from the hops. You want to get rid of all of the bitterness entirely. You just want the hop character and none of the bitterness. So I took some SARS hops and I put them in a brown paper bag, so at least they weren't exposed to light. And then I left them at room temperature for a month, and then I threw them into my lambic. And I did not get any of these sort of cheesy aromas or anything like that, but it definitely did mean that there was virtually no bitterness in those hops whatsoever. So that was my main concern going into brewing this American Pale Ale, is that it would taste more like amber ale or a blonde ale or something, and it just wouldn't have that bitter bite to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all had experiences. Anyone who's brewed a hoppy beer, or multiple batches has had that experience where you take a sip and you're like, wait a minute, I used way more hops in this than it tastes like. What is going on? That's probably, to me, the most common symptom of hops that are just getting a little too long in the tooth. But again, there are these other things. Now, over the years, I have tended to brew with hops that are less than a year old, but I've made a ton of beers with hops that are older than that. Like you said, Martin, there have been times where I'm like, oh, look, I've got Citra from 2016 in the back of my freezer. They smell good. They've been stored well, so I'm going to use them in a batch. Now, for the most part, that's worked out fairly well, though I've definitely had a few batches that presented with these symptoms we were talking about of old hops. Of course, when drinking a beer on its own, it is tough to truly gauge the impact of something like hop age, which is why you performed an experiment on the topic, Martin. Those results when we return from these messages. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Shopify helps you sell at every stage of your business. Like that, let's put it online and see what happens stage.
And the site is live.
That we opened a store and need a fast checkout stage.
Thanks. You're all set.
That count it up and ship it around the globe stage.
This one's going to Thailand.
And that, wait, did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Whatever your stage, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen.
It's time for another season of the Palmetto Porch, an original podcast from Discover South Carolina. I'm Devin Whitmire. Join me as I get to the heart of what makes South Carolina such a great place to visit by speaking to the locals who make it so special. Premiering December 5th, find the Palmetto Porch wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information about our show, visit scpalmettoporch.com.
In the 10 plus years I've been doing this Brewlosophy thing, I've heard from thousands of brewers ranging in experience, and one topic that has come up time after time is what to do with these hops that have been in my fridge or freezer for the last 6 months or a year or 5 years. My typical response is to suggest that they just brew a batch and see how it works out for themselves. If it's bad, you learned something. If it's good, awesome. Martin, you recently had some old Cascade hops that you decided to do an experiment with.
Yeah, and this has been my concern as well, because I went on a little phase of just like bulk buying a ton of hops when Yakima Valley Hops had a sale, and that was great. But those hops did sit around for years, and I was curious, are these still good? Shall I be chucking them and buying some new ones? And it just so happened that I had a bag of Cascade hops, 2017 Cascade hops, completely unopened, so it was still sealed and should be fresh from that perspective. And I also happened to have a bag of newer hops, so the 2022 year Cascade hops, and that was really what got me thinking this could be a good Brewlosophy experiment.
Heck yeah, I love it. Because now, what we're looking at here is fairly well. What we've done is we've isolated just age, because you saved those 2017 hops in your freezer Never opened them. They were, everything as ideal as possible. I guess one could argue also crop year, and there are absolutely crop year differences, organoleptically speaking, between even the same, strain of hops. So, but in this one, what we're trying to look at specifically is I've got these well stored, well taken care of, Cascade hops from 2017. Do they differ? Has there been some degradation in the 5 years between, then and when I got this new batch? I love it.
Right. So the process was I was going to create 2 5-gallon batches of American Pale Ale, and then the variable would be the hops that I used. So the malt bill that I used for the American Pale Ale was pretty simple, 90% pale ale malt, and then 7% caramel, 23% wheat malt. That's pretty standard pale ale recipe for me. So started with that, and then just mashed them at 152 Fahrenheit, that's 67 Celsius, for about an hour. And then when we got to the boil, that's when the variable was introduced. Now, figuring out how to introduce the variable was a little bit of a head scratcher, primarily because there was a big difference in crop years, as you mentioned there, Marshall, which came to the alpha acid percentage. So the newer Cascade hops I had, the 2022, they had a 4.7% alpha acid rating, but the 2017 one were at 7.3%. So quite a bit different. So then the question becomes, do we use the same amount of Cascade hops in both batches and just accept that one will have a potentially higher bitterness than the other, or do we use less of the higher alpha acid hops in one of the batches to try to get to the same IBU? But we all know that IBU calculations are really just a educated guess. So what we ended up doing was kind of settling on a middle ground, which was to only use Cascade as the flavor and aroma hop, so at the 15-minute and the 5-minute edition, and to bitter with something else. So the boil turned out to be 15 grams of Warrior hops as the bittering hop at 60 minutes added to both batches. And then at 15 minutes, added 15 grams of the Cascade hops, both the 2017 and the 2022, and then 25 grams of the Cascade hops at 5 minutes. And when I put that into my brewing calculator, the higher alpha acid Cascade did lead to a slightly higher IBU, but it was only a couple of points, and we felt that was really our best chance to kind of reduce the difference between these two batches based on bitterness alone.
Yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind, I kind of like that the 2017 hops were the ones with the higher alpha acid, because even though they were stored impeccably by you, Martin, there is still arguably some degradation of isoalpha acids to the tune of, I believe when I was kind of toying around with it at the time that we were designing this experiment, you could expect there to be almost about 6% alpha acid as opposed to the 7.3 when they were fresh. So again, that's just a guess, but we still wanted to at least equalize that bittering addition with Warrior hops so that one wasn't obviously more bitter than the other based purely on the alpha acid difference alone. We wanted this to be more about the perceptible qualities in aroma and flavor, not just the bitterness.
Yeah, exactly. So when the boils were complete, the worts were both chilled, and I took measurements indicating the worts were essentially the same OG. I think it was 1 point difference. So the old hops are at 1050, the fresh hops are at 1051. I find that I get this sort of 1 point difference pretty frequently. I don't think it's a function of the hops being used or anything like that. In fact, I just did an experiment this week, and I ended up with 2 points difference between the two, and I think it was just boil vigor or something like that. So not really reading too much into that. Then equal volumes of the wort from both batches were transferred to separate fermenters, and at that point I pitched my yeast, which happened to be Imperial Yeast A07, so that's flagship. Let the beers ferment for about a week at 68 Fahrenheit, that's 20 Celsius, which is typically where I keep flagship at. And then we added one more edition of Cascade, which was the dry hop edition. So we added 25 grams of Cascade into each of the fermenters, of course, making sure to use the 2017 Cascade in that batch and the 2022 in that batch. Then left that for another 5 days, and then took hydrometer measurements. And at that point, we'd reached a final gravity for the 2017 Cascade at 1.008. and the 2022 Cascade was at 1.006. So again, I think pretty much close enough.
Yeah, so they are close enough, but I do think it's kind of fun to go down rabbit holes. And with all of this talk, it doesn't seem to be so common these days as it was a couple years ago, but about hop creep, I did wonder if that fresher Cascade, again, seemingly would have more fresh oils, or maybe even a higher concentration of these oils, if maybe that contributed to a little bit of that hop creep, and maybe that's why it attenuated 2 points more. And when you consider the fact that it was the fresher hop version that came in 1 point higher for the OG, that's three. That's the full delta there is 3 whole specific gravity points altogether. I think it's interesting. I don't think it matters that much, but it's certainly something to just kind of like look at. Keep your eyes on.
Right. That was my thinking as well. That I was looking at that. I was like, 2 points difference. Yeah, that sounds about right. But then I realized that the old hops had the lower original gravity, and finished with the higher final gravity. So yeah, absolutely. Maybe that dry hop addition and the hop creep resulting from that did result in this attenuating down a little bit more than the older hops.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I had one more question for you before we move on. When you are adding, usually when I add dry hops, I don't do it as much for kettle additions, but for whatever reason, when I'm making a dry hop addition, I've got my nose in these hops. I want to know what they smell like, before I add them, just in case. Were you doing any aromatic comparisons when you were making these dry hop additions? And if so, what did you notice at the time?
Yeah, the really unscientific ones where I give it a sniff and I'm like, I have it in my head that the 2022 are going to have a much stronger aroma, and it's like, oh yeah, that definitely is the case. But had you blinded me and given me 3 cups and not told me which was which, then we could have been talking. But yeah, to me, I did think that the newer hops did have a stronger aroma to them, but absolutely, that I don't know if that's true.
You didn't. The old hops though didn't smell like cheese or sweaty socks.
Fortunately not. No, cheese free. So at that point, the beers were pressure transferred to CO2 per 7 kegs, put them in my Keyser, let them condition on gas for about a week and carbonate them. Then they were ready for evaluation. So just taking a look at these 2 beers, I mean, they looked identical. The first thing to say, I mean, they look like pale ales, the golds, really white cap of foam at the top, a little bit of haze. I mean, I didn't find the beers, so I was absolutely expecting that because I dry top these things. So a little bit of haze, but they just, to me, looked identical.
I've got the photo up in front of me right now, and they look great. Again, like you said, I'm guessing that's just a hop polyphenol haze from the dry hop edition that would ultimately fall out over time. But who cares? Because you want that nice hoppiness. They look no different to me, and I don't know if I would expect any difference. It's based on the hop age necessarily. So at this point, they just look like the same beer.
Right. So it was ready for me to do my own personal triangle test, and this was one of the first experiments I did for Brewlosophy. I think this was like my second one ever. And I went into this thinking about these triangle tests, and I was like, I am going to nail these. This is going to be so easy. And the reason I think it's easy is because when we, as the brewer, go into these tests, we have all the information at our fingertips, whereas the regular participants of a survey are told nothing. I mean, we tell them nothing. It's just, here's 3 cups, 2 of the beers are the same, 1 is different, off you go. I knew exactly what to look for. And all of these things that we've been discussing earlier in the show about that bitterness change that we might get from the beta acids, I know to look for stuff like that. And I know to look for maybe signs of oxidation from the hops, whatever. I'm going in very much not blind. So I'm going to take 5 triangle tests myself, and we do 5 because we're going in only semi-blinded. Now, the first test I did, super confident, and this was on the Brewlosophy show, so there's cameras everywhere, and I'm like super confident. The beers are served to me, and I get it completely wrong, and I'm just, oh no, this isn't as easy as I think it was going to be. But then on test 2, I do notice just on the finish, there is this kind of unpleasant bitterness, like more acidic bitterness in one of the beers than the other 2. And I think, you know what? That is going to be the old hops. And it turned out I was right. And then I took the remaining 3 tests, and every time I was just absolutely nailing it. I would take a sip and I would say old hop or new hop, slam it down on the table, pick up the next one. Oh, let's try this one. That's the new hop. Next one, that's the old hop. And I could just absolutely pick it out every single time. So once I trained myself on it, it was very easy to tell the difference, at least for me.
But how would you describe the, what's the best way to put this? The vastness of the difference. Because sometimes once you pinpoint something, you notice it, but it doesn't, that doesn't speak to just how, minimal the difference actually is. It's just that you notice it now. Were these beers like, wow, they're wildly different? If somebody had served you one or the other one, consecutively, would you be able to tell that it was a different beer if you were chatting with your friends type of thing?
No, absolutely not. It was a very specific thing only on the back end of the finish that I could tell. And, had I been just a regular taster trying these beers, like everybody else, I would have got this wrong because on my first go, I couldn't distinguish them. And it wasn't until I did it enough times that I was able to pick this thing out. And then afterwards, it was easy to tell, but only because I knew for that one exact thing to look for. Both beers, I felt, came out really well. I was very happy with both of them. I enjoyed drinking both of them after the experiments were done. So I would say the difference was distinguishable, but pretty subtle.
Yeah. So that we rarely talk about this aspect of the triangle test, but oftentimes when we're getting criticized by people who don't like the results of a specific experiment, it's because they're sitting and saying, well, if you had a highly trained taster who knew everything that you did and then let them do it, the findings would be more meaningful. Here's the thing. When what we're after is, can the regular beer drinker, when asked to focus even, can they pick up a difference between these beers based on the variable that's being tested? We don't really care if somebody who has been trained for 15 years to pick up, a slight percentage more bitterness than another beer. We don't care if they can do it. What we're after are, we're asking beer drinkers to focus more than they usually would, on a triangle test. And if they still can't pick out a difference, then I think we can say with some confidence, it doesn't have as big of an impact as some people might believe it does. But maybe it has an impact. We're just saying that, on a kind of a gross level, it's not that huge. So with that said, we served these beers triangle tests to 20 different participants, out of which 11 would have had to identify the unique sample in the triangle test in order for us to say, again, with some confidence, that there is some perceptible difference in these beers. In the end, we needed 11. How many actually was able to identify the unique sample in the triangle test?
We needed 11. We got 9. So this came back as not significant. And I should say that when we do these tests, we do say that these are participants with varying levels of experience, which means these could be like real beer nerds, or it could be, often it's just my next door neighbors that are willing to amuse me and go through one of these tests. But in this particular case, I actually took the beer to a brewery, and they laid on brewing professionals to this brewery and ancillary fermentation. So everybody who tasted the beer either worked in brewing, or was teaching brewing at the local college, or was a head brewer somewhere. So these were actually experts, all of them. And out of those 20 experts, only 9 of them could distinguish the beers. Not
even half. And that's not to say that, they're bad tasters. No, what that says is that the impact of the 5-year-old hops was, if different at all, which I think we would agree that it probably was, just wasn't so vast that it made these beers taste different. And I think in terms of implications, that just means that if you are taking care of your hops and storing them well, keeping them out of light, keeping them in their Mylar bags and storing them in the freezer type of deal, if you're doing that, you can get away with using those hops for a few years at least. These results would suggest up to 5 years at least, and likely not create a crappy beer in the end. And I think that's really a really good thing for brewers who may not be able to brew as often and still want to save money by purchasing in bulk.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, the head brewer of ancillary fermentation, when I revealed the variable after everyone had completed their survey, he kind of scoffed and he said, well, no wonder we couldn't tell a difference then. He said that in his view, 5-year-old hops, as long as they had been kept in the freezer and had not been oxidized, he said, you just would not expect any difference. He would not have any issue using that in one of his commercial beers even.
Yeah.
So for them, they just did not see that as an issue.
Now, I want to just a little side caveat that I just remembered. This is based on, we're receiving fresh hops when we buy them, and then whatever we do with them is our fault. That's our responsibility. There was a bit of a kerfuffle a few years ago where I'm not going to name the name, but a fairly big, hop company that we are not in any way associated with got caught selling old hops to their accounts likely because they knew that, hey, we can get away with doing it. But they were slapping on modern stickers, saying, oh, these are 2021 hops, when really they came from the 2019 crop year and they were leftovers. Don't do that. What we want is to know that we're getting the hops that we're paying for as fresh as possible, so that then we can preserve that freshness. I just thought that was an interesting thing that just came to mind. Anyways, given my own personal experiences with using old hops that have been stored well, I honestly have zero concerns using them. I remember getting a lot of crap if I would say something, as brewlosophy, if I'd say something on some forum about, hey, just use your hops as long as you're storing them well, 4, 5, even 6 years, you're going to get away with just fine. And people, oh no, you can't do that. You're the reason they're making bad beer. Well, we've actually got some data to back up this opinion of mine. And just to remind people that by storing hops well, all I'm referring to is keeping them in a freezer where exposure to light and oxygen are minimal, and just keeping them in their Mylar bags. Like I said, I stopped using that vacuum sealer about 6 or 7 years ago. So we do have some reader comments I'd like to get to. The first one comes from somebody called HC, who says, another interesting outcome, at least to me, of the experiment is Martin's personal perception that the beer dosed with older hops seemed more bitter. To me, the beer made with older hops had a slightly more bitter finish, whereas the beer made with 2022 hops, he's just quoting you, Martin. The opposite of this would be expected given the alpha acids degrade over time. However, the 2017 hops had a much higher alpha acid percentage compared to 2022. 2017 was at 7.2, 2022 was at 4.7. He says, I'm not sure what IBU model was used, but the Tinsith model, for example, has been shown to significantly underestimate late addition hops until about 20 minutes. For a beer that's made with significant late addition hops, 1 ounce at 5 minutes, for example, when a moderate to high alpha acid hop is used, actual versus expected IBUs could be significantly different, which may be the reason behind the higher perceived bitterness of the old hop batch. There is a modified Tinsith model called MIBU that adjusts the Tinsith for this shortcoming. What do you think about this kind of proposition that HC is making about why the older beer but was perceived by you, at least, to be slightly more bitter than the fresher hot beer?
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense, right? That we're putting higher alpha acid, potentially higher alpha acid hops in of those late additions, especially the dry hop. Big surprise if that turns out to come out a slightly more bitter beer than the other one. But it wasn't really just sort of, it tastes a bit more bitter that I was picking up on, that thing that I could tell on the back of my throat. It was really a different type of bitterness that I could taste, which I think is the beta acids that I'm tasting, rather than just a stronger, higher alpha acid kind of hop taste.
Yeah, that is where my mind automatically goes. Now, I'm very, it drives my wife crazy, but I'm unique in that I don't need answers. I don't need to know the why. As much as I like to know it, I don't make stuff up just to make myself feel good, or confident in a conclusion. It may very well be that HC is accurate, that the higher alpha acids in the 2017 hops that you used are the reason for that somewhat slightly, more bitter character that you perceived in that beer. I'm still kind of leaning into the beta acid thing just based on your description of that hop quality or that bitterness quality. But if it is the alpha acid thing, I think one thing that speaks to then is that storing the hops well, the way that you did, really did seem to preserve the alpha acid content then, right? Because if it's more bitter, that means that it still maintained a higher alpha acid content than even the fresher, arguably much lower alpha acid Cascade that you use. So, that's interesting either way, I guess is what I'm saying, is that whether it's the alpha acid or the beta acid that you're tasting, there's interesting implications regardless.
Right. Yeah. My one concern was, we said this right up front, is there's just not going to be enough bitterness to this older batch because it's just going to have degraded. And that certainly was not the case.
Yeah. Yep. So next comment comes from Tim Wickland, who left this on Facebook. In fact, I believe he commented on the Brewlosophy Show video about this experiment, which you can find at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy-show. Tim said, I recently made a New Zealand Pilsner with some old mistreated Hallertau Blanc hops. They were free, he says, and the isovaleric acid was so bad I had to dump it. I saved a bottle to share at my next club meeting, though. I would love to hear from some of those club members who got to taste that, because I remember isovaleric acid is cheesy. It's that kind of like, it's just cheesy. It's gross. So to have a beer that very noticeably has that character to it, ugh.
How very kind to save a bottle and make sure your fellow club members get to try it as well.
That's hilarious. Final comment comes from Steve Delius on Facebook as well. He says, I've used 7-year-old hops in a few of my last beers, and I have not noticed any loss of aroma or flavor. I mean, 7 years, that's pretty old, Martin. Yeah,
7 years, that's a lot. And I would be curious to know what the hops were. Were they high alpha acid, low alpha acid, what? But I think if 5 years works, why not 7?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, and as long as they're stored well, if 7 years works, why not 10? I mean, we're homebrewers here. We can play around with this stuff. Now, if you're interested in this topic, we've done quite a few experiments comparing old hops to more fresh hops, but those old hops were treated in various ways. Like I said, we've got an experiment where the hops were left out, on a workbench for a while in the summertime. I believe we've got another experiment like this looking at a less fruity, pungently fruity hop. I think it was Willamette or something like that. So go check out brewlosophy.com. You'll find those things. Just search up, hop age or something like that. It'll be on the website. Martin, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Did you have any final comments?
Well, this experiment was really a bit of a revelation for me because it just gave me that confidence that if I store my hops properly, I can keep them around. And, just very recently, I was looking to buy a hop variety that's pretty uncommon. I found some on Yakima Valley, but they only had the 2021 batch for sale. And I might have thought 2 or 3 times, twice before buying that sort of stuff in the past. And now I know, well, they're going to treat it well and I'm going to put it straight in the freezer. It's going to be good. So should you be digging around in your freezer and you find that bag of hops somewhere out the back, do not be afraid to use it. Give it a go.
That's exactly my point as well. And, to give some love to Yakima Valley hops, which I don't think they need us to do that. Everybody loves YVH. Not only do they store them well, if those hops are more than a year old and they've got a fresh crop behind it, they almost cut the price in half. So you could save some coin by getting, hops that are still going to work perfect in your beer and just from a previous crop year. So, well, don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Brewlosophy's Kate Jobe takes you into the lab with real brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
It's time for another season of the Palmetto Porch, an original podcast from Discover South Carolina. I'm Devin Whitmire. Join me as I get to the heart of what makes South Carolina such a great place to visit by speaking to the locals who make it so special. Premiering December 5th, find the Palmetto Porch wherever you get your podcasts. And for more information about our show, visit scpalmettoporch.com.